Hello, fellow Beatle people. I'm Des from the Without the Beatles podcast. I've said many times on the main podcast that the origins of the podcast was an abortive documentary that I was trying to make back in 2012 without the Beatles. And we travelled to America and Europe and the UK, interviewed about 40 people, and then I screwed up the negotiations and it didn't happen as a film. I was left with 40, 50 interviews on a hard drive that had no home. We've used a few of these interviews in this first year of Without the Beatles, like Steve Van Zandt, Mary Kwan, and Lemmy. But there's so many more. And what's happened is that people have started approaching us and saying, can we be on the podcast? The new interviews, of course, just because they're slightly more topical, we're going to go with those where we can. So I thought it's time to just start drip feeding out that archive of some amazing people. And yes, forgive the non-topicality of some of the issues, but the essence of it, how did the Beatles impact my life? How did they impact my career? How did they impact my creative thinking? That hasn't changed and is worth hearing direct. So uncut, untouched, these are the archive interviews from the original Without the Beatles documentary. And here's the first one, Andy Partridge from XTC. Hope you enjoy this one and the ones to follow.
Through that.
I'll be all right.
Suffering for the art.
You're suffering for the art.
Yeah.
No, it's your turn.
Yeah, I'm suffering for my art. Now you're going to suffer.
I always ask everyone the same question, irrespective of where we go later on. But could you imagine a world without the Beatles? If not, one?
Hang on, just before we start, do I have to say the question in the answer? Because sometimes you.
Well, the trouble is, if everyone does that, then we'd end up with a big. I think that's the textbook way of doing it, but it never works when you're ready.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So could I imagine?
Oh, well, without the Beatles, if not, why not?
I couldn't imagine a world without the Beatles. I mean, just personally, for me, they were a template for how to be as a kid and as a teenager. You know, everything from, what did the Beatles teach you? Well, I went to see A Hard Day's Night in my shorts and duffel coat, and I learned that I shouldn't be screaming at other boys. So that was a lesson. All the girls could scream, so I learned a social lesson. You're not to scream. Doesn't go well with the shorts. No, they taught me all sorts of things. I mean, I wouldn't be a musician if it wasn't for the Beatles. The desire to be in the kind of franchise of gang that they had, if you know what I mean. They had this gang franchise, and it kicked off millions of gang franchises everywhere. Hey, so all we've got to do is get some guitars, hang out together, all be in a big house like they are in Help. I was sold by that, because I used to fantasize about having a bed in the floor, and there's John Lennon in a bed in the floor, and he's got the bed, and there's Paul McCartney playing the organ that comes up out of the floor, and he's got DC Comics. Paul McCartney's got DC Comics, just like me. No, they were a huge template for everything I wanted.
Did that extend into later years when they start, being more spiritually conscious and stuff like that? Was it just a music and gang thing in the beginning and musical? What was the full extent of that piece?
How long have you got? It was certainly the clothes front, and believe it or not, it was the hair front too. I have wavy hair. It's waving goodbye to my head. It was the clothes front. It was most of all, it was the humour that got me. And I think it was the humour that got everyone else. Sure, they wrote great songs, but the reason why anyone over the age of 16 loved it is because they were bloody funny. And any TV show or radio show that you were on, your granny would be rolling around, clutching her sides with laughter. And it's like, wow, that's got what is this power, this humor power, So that was extremely learnable. And I could see it was like their defense mechanism, and I thought, whoa, that's a good defense mechanism. I think I'll use that, And I did. And I had my Beatle haircut at school, and I was like, junior Beatle with all the quips and all the, a little bit of cruelty and a little bit of sort of surreal kind of fun. Because they really took the whole Goons thing and ran with it, It was Spike Malignant. John Lennon was Spike Malignant. But the humour was it goes without saying, the music, but the thing that broke all barriers for anyone over 16 was that humour. I mean, they were marketed in the States as the new Marx Brothers. And so you can see that even before anyone had heard a note, it was like, oh, let's see what these new Marx Brothers can do. They were funny.
There was a great clip on Ken Dodd the other night on that cabin talk. Do you see it? Where he's saying, do you see it?
He's one of the few people in England that, along with the Beatles, that had a distinctive haircut. What is it? What's in the water in Liverpool?
Well, he's interviewing them live on TV, and he says, they were all talking about having nicknames like Ringo and stuff. And he goes, "Could you come up with something a bit more earthy for me?" And George just goes, "Sod."
And Sod Dodd.
But it's just really funny because they're all laughing, so you could tell it wasn't scripted and just being normal. But actually, one of the things we were looking at is people like Ozzy Osbourne have said this, was not just the fact, everything you just said, but also the fact they weren't from London and they had accents and stuff like that, which that probably have impacted the generation before you a bit more than you. But
I think so. I mean, we copied we all had Swindon accents at school, but we would try and speak in Liverpudlian, and it was a horrible mixture. Well, you give it a go then, all right, and so it's you can imagine people from Swindon trying to talk in a Liverpool accent. Road crash.
But the importance of, it's the DIY ethic of, you can do it no matter where you're from, was that important? Did that actually play any part in being, because it's not the obvious place to come from either as a musician, Swindon, if you're going to make it in the horrible thing.
No, I must have done something terrible in a past life if I find myself in this one living in Swindon. I know I'm paying for my karma. I must have been a dictator or something. No, I don't think I thought about the regional side of it at all. They were it was totally an aspirational template of that's how you are. And then it gets further compounded by other things. You see the Monkees, and wait a minute, they're doing the Beatles template and they're successful. Oh, okay. So yeah. And it's really compounding that thing, And I also, all around you socially, I don't think there was ever a band or ever an entertainment anything that was marketed to such an extent as the Beatles were. You could dress from head to foot in Beatle clothing, Beatle boots, socks with the Beatles' heads on, Beatle trousers. There's George advertising these Beatle trousers and Beatle jeans, and shirts, T-shirts, jumpers, plastic wig. My cousin Paul had a Beatles plastic wig, and I used to put it on, and it really cut my head because it was so small. And I used to think, if this is modelled to true scale, the Beatles must all be microcephalics because this is tiny. This hurts my head. But you could, you dress head to foot in Beatle clothing. My friend Harry Butterworth, who's came from Liverpool, his parents had Beatle wallpaper in their living room. Just very tasteful, just up above the chimney breast. Nothing too distasteful. But they had the whole. You could go to school with a Beatle lunchbox. You could have a Beatle cap, strum a Beatle guitar. Who else has done that? I mean, don't say Kiss, please. Kiss aren't even in the same county when it comes to merchandising, and so everywhere you turned, there was Beatle-ness. It was almost kind of, like Mao Zedong or something, it was on, if you'd have had pictures of John, Paul, George and Ringo on walls, you wouldn't have batted an eyelid, something like Mao, Big Brother's watching you. It was so pervasive.
But obviously, musically, it did have an impact on you. What do you think it is? We don't need to re-summarize everything that everyone's ever said about the history of the Beatles, but what was specifically the impact on you? What do you think you took into your songwriting and production?
As a child, I loved novelty records. Things with a little bit too much reverb, sped up voices, strange instrumentation, little cutaway vignettes in the song where they'd act things out, like My Boomerang Won't Come Back, or The Mole in the Hole, or, these your kind of standard 50s novelty things. I love those. And when the Beatles got into experimenting with all these weird noises and stuff, it was exactly the same. It's a bit too much reverb. It's tape repeat, slowed down, sped up voices, little kind of unusual comical bits and or funny sounds and things. And I just sort of transferred my allegiance from novelty records to, wow, they're doing the same kind of things. And I think that appealed to them as well. The whole George Martin was making some of the best novelty records ever. And I'm sure that's why the Beatles latched on to working with him. This fella knows how to get those odd sounds, And when 66 or whatever, when they really started growing into unusual noises, that I was totally and utterly besotted with them. I mean, the first time I heard Strawberry Fields Forever, it was like something from Mars, and somebody from Mars was communicating to me personally. But it used all these sounds that they used on 50s novelty records that I loved as a kid. And so it was this weird kind of historical loop had come back on me, and I was totally floored.
One thing that's always puzzled me is the coincidence of having a band that experimental, but as a connoisseur yourself, is anyone else's records better recorded? No, everyone else's records, from that time sound thin and tinny and like I love the Zombies stuff, but it doesn't sound as well recorded.
Sound like demos up to
recorded on cellotape.
Yeah, the Beatles had the best engineer, the best arranger, producer, the best studios in the world, the best equipment. They weren't great players, but that wasn't important. They played just well enough to get the idea over, and they could always turn to George Martin and say, I want something da-da-da-da here, make it happen, and he'd go away and write something up or flip the tape backwards or speed stuff up and slow stuff down, so he was like some people say George Martin, fifth Beatle. Well, sometimes I think he's the first Beatle, because he's the very funnel that they're putting all their ideas and desires through, and their wants. They just come and say, I want this, and he has to make it happen,
I mean, my iPod's huge and my record collection's huge, but I was trying to think recently how big my musical lexicon owes to them in terms of, a production palette and, chord structures and things and ideas. And I was sitting there thinking, really, I think it's probably in the horribly like 50 or 60%. I mean, there's loads of stuff but everyone else is a slice. I wonder
they totally spoiled. The Beatles made the template for pop groups, and they also spoiled the template for pop groups, because you could never get to the height that they were at and as good at what they were doing. And of course, they were doing it all before anybody. You want some metal? Well, they've been there. You want the weird? Well, they've been there. You want the Indian stuff? They've been there. George Harrison, on his own, opened up India to England. The man brings back a sitar and flirts with sitar lessons, and all of a sudden, India means something to people in England rather than just being a Vesta Curry or a cricket team. It means, whoa, there's a subcontinent there, and one of the Beatles is interested in it. Whoa, single-handedly, George Harrison brought India to English consciousness.
In a non-colonial way, which is...
In a non-colonial, non-judgmental kind of way.
Which is
just put the sitar down, George. Move away from the sitar, George.
The irony of that, of course, is when you see the first time he came across it. Apparently, it was on set of Hard Day's Night when they're in a car.
Oh, and they're playing.
It's on PC and non-complimentary.
They're playing Hard Day's Night in a. That's my sitar impression, folks.
both that and then Leo McKernan help. It's not an auspicious start to their relationship with with Eastern culture, but but they got there in the end. The other thing that I've always found interesting about XTC's career and the way it went was so it seems to me like in the beginning, it's definitely not a reaction to the Beatles, but it's all moved on. And then as it moved on, you were allowed to be a bit more free with what you're doing, and like the love of it comes back and is a bit more explicit. So I was wondering what your own version of the changing nature of your relationship to the music in terms of your own is.
When we first started, we actually cut the first things we ever recorded in Abbey Road. And, engineers were nudging us saying, oh, aren't you excited to be in the home of the Beatles and all this kind of thing? And to be truthful, I'd never given it a thought, because I don't think I historically made the connection about where they'd recorded. And it was the same building I was in. I was too busy making a record for it to be of importance. But as the career went on, and then I remember in 1983 we were making an album called Mummer, and the producer and engineer was a fellow called Steve Nye, and I'd written a song called Lady Bird, and I took Steve Nye aside and I said, look, Steve, this song, I'm afraid it sounds a little bit Beatley. I'm a bit worried about it, because people are going to say, yeah, you're trying to write stuff like the Beatles. And I'm really not. It just came out like that. And he said, you shouldn't hide that. Just go with it. If you want it to sound a bit Beatley, or if it sounds a bit Beatley and you'd like it to sound, just go with it. Let's do it like that. And so a little light bulb went off in my head. I thought, God, I shouldn't be ashamed that I like the Beatles. Why not? And that sort of opened the floodgates for, hey, this one sounds a bit like the Beatles as well. Don't worry about it. Let it go, And so that was a sort of a realization for me that it was okay to be a bit like the Beatles. Yeah, why not? They'd played such an enormous role in my younger life that I guess I sort of cut them out when when I grew up. I cut that out. And that was when I was younger. But it came around and bit my ass, because it's okay to sound like the Beatles. Why not?
I didn't have it that way around, because I discovered them myself, because when I was 5, it was 72. And so they felt like they were my band, and I didn't have to react against anyone playing them. The thing I reacted against was all the soundtrack music and, musicals and stuff that my parents and gran and stuff playing. And I came back to that later on. It's probably part of the...
Yeah, same
I'm now a big Cole Porter fan, So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my father used to play jazz stuff, and as a kid I thought, I'm never going to like jazz, and then he'd go to work and I'd surreptitiously slip the albums out and I'd just put this one on, I quite like this, because I never let him know that,
No. So interesting. So what's how much would you say, as we grow up, how much would you say your personality has got Beatle traits in it? So that bloody mindedness that Andy Partridge is famous for, is there a bit of Lennon in there, or is that a bit of McCartney, or is that a bit of George? It could be a bit of all three in their own way.
It's certainly the Beatle funny bone. I certainly grew one of those. And not just because of John Lennon. Everybody thinks, John Lennon's the funny Beatle. No, he's not. They're all bloody funny. Those Beatle Christmas records, the sort of flexi disc things. They're a little bit drunk making those. And actually, I think George Martin said the hardest job he ever had was editing out the profanities, of which there was one every few seconds on those Beatle Christmas records, because they just get the wind down at the end of the day and just blur it, But there's, McCartney's saying, we hope that everybody's enjoyed listening to our records as much as we've enjoyed melting them. And it's a really, and Lennon laughs his head off at this. And they were all funny. They just all seemingly couldn't open their mouths without this humor thing coming out. And that took with me, that gave me, okay, I like that. That seems to be that's part of the kit. You've got to have the hair. I'm going to have to learn to play the guitar, obviously. but definitely need that humor. I can do humor. So that the need to have Beatle humor in my life was, yeah, it gave me a lot of protection, I think. The bloody mindedness, I don't know if I am bloody mindedness. I'm particular. Probably as particular as they were as well. But, you know, if somebody's not making your music correct, say a producer is taking your music in an area you don't want it to go, I'll tell them and let it be known that I'm not happy and we got to get it back on track. I don't want it to go like this. It's my song, please, Mr. Producer, and it's got to go like this, you know. And so I have, I guess, gathered a reputation for being a little difficult, but I don't think it's not, how shall I say, vicious difficulty. It's particular difficulty. I know how my art should go. And if I find it being pulled out, it's like a birthing process, you know. The baby's got to be pulled out correctly. And if not, then mother's going to get upset and baby's going to get upset, you know. And if you're pulling this baby out of me, do it nicely. Use some, you know, put some Vaseline on those tongs.
Well, let me put it to you this way, though. I think even on the Beatles' first sessions, you know, it's like you've got 4 hours, you know, put a tie on, be nice to the producer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and before that, you know, you just come in, you're not allowed in the control room. Who changed that? They enable you to even allow you to have that kind of attitude with the producer.
Yeah.
Well, think about it.
Totally. That. In fact, I was disappointed that the people in Abbey Road working around us didn't have the white coats on and the brown coats. You know, the people who did all the shifting of pianos and stuff like that, they'd have the brown coats on, and then the people that actually touched the controls had the white coats on. That was the differentiation. But by the time we got in there in the late 70s, it was nobody had these coats on. I was a little disappointed about that.
It's quite interesting when you think about it, because you know what I was saying about me with the you know, not being born. Most people don't want to look at life in those kind of small steps. You know, they like, because it preserves a lot of yourself if you don't do that. But actually, in reality, it's the sliding doors. It's a wonderful life thing, isn't it? You know, so how much of your life is dependent on you, say, having been a musician? So what, personalised for me? So what we talk about? Where would you have met your partner? Where would your children be? Because do you know what I mean? Because if you weren't doing that, what would you have been doing? So, you know, at the deep level.
Oh, goodness. Whoa. That's a bit of a giant-sized question. It's like, tell me about everything in the universe. Go. You've got 10 minutes. Go. So where to start? I certainly wouldn't have... No, I just wouldn't be here talking to you now if it weren't for the Beatles. I can't quite tell you what it is. It's like some mystery magic smoke that you've breathed in as a young kid, and you think, I want some of that. I love that. I love that music. I love the way they're funny. I love the way they look. I can do that. Obviously, girls like them. Hey, so if I'm like that, girls will like me too. And then, yeah, it'll all work great, you know. And at one time, I wanted to maybe see the world by being in the Navy like my dad was. But when you see the Beatles, you know, on the TV and on the cinema, you know, jetting around the planet, you think, hang on a minute, if I learn to play a guitar, I won't have to be in a ship to go around the world and wear a uniform. I can be like that and see the world. And then, damn it, don't you know it? It's kind of what happened. So it's almost impossible to tell you because it's so all pervasive. It was all pervasive in growing up, everything from the merchandising to the accent to the music to certainly the humor. Goodness knows the humor was so important. But I don't think I'd be here now as a musician and you talking to me if it wasn't for the Beatles.
What you're in one place to judge it, but so if you weren't in position to do that, you wouldn't have had the career you've had. What have been the things that you've been proud of that you wouldn't have accomplished then? In if so that could range from someone saying your music saved their life through to a Grammy Award. But what is it about? What's that career enabled you to have in terms of those sensations that you wouldn't have had them without?
The ability to be creative, and the thing is, you're going to get deep here. The thing is, when anybody influences you to such an extent that the Beatles certainly influenced me, there is that Greek mythology thing of you want to kill your idols. You want to kill them by being better than them and take their skin and then put it on. It's real stuff from Greek mythology, So I guess deep inside of me, I wanted to write songs. If they weren't better than the Beatles, they were certainly, I felt they were on a par with some of the things the Beatles did. And I may get shot down in flames, certainly by English people, but not so much Americans. I think some of the things I've written have been sort of on a par with some Beatles songs. But it's that desire to kill them and put their skin on and say, ha, I'm king of the world now. And that's just a normal, natural human desire. The same way you want to kill your father and replace, be married to your mother as a young child. Do you see what I mean? It's that same thing with your heroes. You want to, I can be as good as that, and then I'm going to be better, and then I'm going to take their place, and I'm going to be the one that's that rich and famous and adored, and I'm going to be the one they make a plastic Beatle wig, although it would be exceedingly tight if it was a copy of my hairdo.
Just for the record, I never wanted to kill my dad. I'm marrying my mum. Completely the opposite, but that's a personal thing.
It's a
maybe the other way around. Anything,
Yeah, wanted to marry me dad. No, the Freudian slip is showing there.
Some of your songs where you've written about your dad, when I read them, I was thinking my mum. It's like that. I'm only ever gonna know how I feel about my mum when she's popped her clogs, I think. So she's my aunt now. She's a good aunt, but she's been a good grandmother. But
no, I have some real issues with my parents.
We gathered from the songs there.
Yeah. Well, it's all part of the landscape. You never met an artist who was untroubled. They wouldn't be artists if they were. I mean, look at the Beatles. Look at the trouble and misery and loss, separation, death that they had in their upbringing. That stuff forges you. That stuff, makes you want to create. Well, you have to. If you didn't create, you'd go insane.
One of the things about the Beatles story, which never ceases to amaze me, bearing in mind the generation they were born into and the people around them, I mean, it's just been one long catalogue of death from the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
It's quite amazing.
Yeah. Death and just loss of all sorts of things, But I don't know anybody in the arts that had a lovely, genteel, normal upbringing. They wouldn't be an artist if they did. They wouldn't want to make music or sculpt or paint or.
It's one of the horrors of the modern day. So some of the, a lot of the kids I meet just want to be famous, but I haven't actually. I've met two types of people now. There are people who want to create and almost don't care if they're famous, but then there's kids who actually just need a lot of clapping.
Well, I certainly needed a lot of clapping because I was never told that anything I did was of any worth. So that stood me good stead. Actually, failure has been really brilliant for me. Failure has been a fantastic motor for me because, you'd make an album and then you say, okay, it's not sold by the bucket load. So therefore, next one's got to be so much better. And the next one is you think it's better and you try to make it better. No, that's not sold by the bucket load either. Okay, next one's going to be even better and even better and even. And we're one of the XTC. We're one of the few bands in history where we started off going, and actually I think got pretty stellar just because of failure. And that failure comes from your parents not saying well done or You know, anything you do, you look, Dad, is a drawing of a horse. That doesn't look anything like a horse. That's rubbish. Oh, I better learn to draw a horse better. You know, it's that constant feeling of you're not pleasing your parents in any way, and that goes through with you. And of course, we weren't pleasing critics, or we weren't pleasing the audience. So next record's got to be better. Next one's got to be better. Failure's a fantastic driver.
I do think from if skipping the Dukes, but from Oranges and Lemons on, they are just like better albums as they go.
But that's the only way. That's the only way to be, is to we never set on cruise control ever, and we always look to make it so much better than the previous one, and that's purely the failure thing. You know, the Beatles weren't a failure. You know, we can't be failures. We've got to do better. And so there we go. We're back to them again. So you've got to live up to those standards. They made this ruler by which you measure your. They really ruined it for everybody. You can't be as good as the Beatles.
I think it's interesting though, in terms of your path, because I mean, I know you've covered it in songs. You know, like Chalk Hills and Children, right, for example. But there comes a point where you're having your Beatle moments and everything, and then suddenly that's not good enough, like, and obviously with, you know, not touring and all this kind of stuff. So that may have been your way of seeing the world, but ultimately you end up rejecting it anyway, or it doesn't suit you, or whatever.
The not touring thing. Now, there's a Beatle thing. You see, I was having a lot of trouble on tour. I was having a lot of trouble. We were having trouble as a group because we weren't seeing any money from tours, you know, corrupt management, the whole. We weren't seeing, in 5 years of touring, we never saw any money, and we were playing quite big gigs at the end of it, you know, thousands of 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 seaters and on, you know. Never saw any money, so I was really troubled by that, and we never had any time to stop. And I was addicted to Valium, which I never kind of clocked at the time, you know. Decided I was going to stop taking Valium. It was decided for me by my brand new wife at the time, who just tipped them all down the lavatory, and I was, I don't need those, you know, what did I take those for? Of course, and then my brain started to melt. So there I was, totally naive, doing cold turkey withdrawal from 13 years of Valium addiction, really upset that I was trapped on this treadmill. And I was starting to wig out touring. You know, it was too much pressure for me. I was like having nervous breakdowns, and it's, I've got to stop doing this. And what's the template for stopping touring? Well, the Beatles couldn't handle it in a different sort of way, so maybe it's okay if I can't handle it. And you know what? They stopped touring, and maybe their music got better. Maybe that'll happen to me. I decided to stop touring, and XTC's music got a lot better. I just had the time to write. I wasn't, you know, jumping from one changing room to a car, to an airplane, to a van, to a hotel room, to a studio. And so I had a really troubled time in my life. I had to look for what was the guideline. You know, if I stop touring, is it gonna ruin the band? No, it didn't seem to ruin the Beatles. Why should it ruin us? You know,
Worked for Brian Wilson as well, of course.
it worked for Brian Wilson, fine, yeah.
Yeah. There must, although in retrospect, how do you feel about that these days? About, you know, do you feel like ultimately though the band suffered and the kind of exposure to it suffered for that? It's kind of game with two halves, that one, isn't it?
It's a difficult one, because if we had alternate history now and somebody said, well, okay, you stay on the Valium, you don't worry about being ripped off, and you keep banging your head against the touring wall, I think we would have got quite big in a kind of REM U2 sort of capacity, sounding nothing like those bands, but I think we would have. But that's an alternate history, and it wasn't to be like that. You know, I was addicted to Valium. I was very upset that we were being ripped off royally, and I wanted a life. I actually wanted a kind of normal life. You know, I wanted to live in a house, not a hotel, and I wanted kids, and to be normal, you know. So it was, I think it was the perfect storm for me, or the imperfect storm, you know. I can't imagine it being any other way now.
No, one day I have it in my head that I'm going to find a way to get you to do a Brian Wilson, you know, like a kind of one-off at the Royal Festival.
Well, if you supply it wouldn't be a sand tray, would it? Coming from Wiltshire, it'd be a dung box, I suppose.
No, I still think you should do that. You should do like, with like a one-off with like a, special put together band and recreate the best bits of the stuff and do it, Do that
Yeah,
fairly.
no, I don't like seeing older pop stars up on stage shaking their middle-aged
You don't have to
wobbly
shake
bits around
anything.
it. Well, you know what I mean. I think I wasn't Max Shaw if I didn't shake some wobbly bits.
Oh,
Boy,
you
I've got
should do.
wobbly bits these days.
Oh, won't we all? But okay.
Let's drag it back to the Fab Four.
Well, it's kind of related because the idea is if you owe that much to them, what did you do? That's the point. So that's the point. So is it who's ever referenced you that you've been proud of and said, Andy Partridge has made a really big impact on me, and XTC have?
Oh, sheesh. I don't know. You hear tales of all sorts of bands saying, "Oh, I really love XTC," and the buggers never do it in print because we're mighty uncool in England. I think American bands are not afraid to. What's his name? John Frusciante, Red Hot Chili Peppers. I think he's a big fan. I think Johnny Green is a Radiohead, actually. Then you hear all sorts of people saying, so-and-so, I met so-and-so in the dressing room and he said he really loved XTC. But you never hear that in print because I think we're considered uncool, But don't even get me on the whole coming from Swindon, the yokel thing. They come from Swindon. So Swindon's a joke town. They must be a joke group. That's the conception in England, I think. But that doesn't work in Japan because the Japanese audience don't have any concept of Swindon, or the American audience don't have any concept of Swindon. It's just the whole kind of Slough and The Office. Swindon is England's joke town, So anything from Swindon must be a joke.
I've never really come across it apart from it's that snide thing that journalists do where they just mention it all the time. So
yeah.
If a band's from London, they don't say
for a laugh.
Yeah, because you don't say London-based, whatever. Indeed,
no. Well, when we started, our management said that we're not to mention that we come from Swindon, and can we drop our yokel accents? Can we, can you talk a bit more like you come from London? And if people say where you come from, where are you from? Say London, But of course, we all talk like bloody Robert Newton. So you can't hide that accent up. It's in the blood,
I want to just pick up a fun point, the thing that we were talking about in the kitchen, really. Do you think the thing that was important for me was that, the Beatles marked the start of various forms of art? So you've got the sleeves, you've got the idea of a singer-songwriter, you're only an art, forgetting Frank and Elvis, you're only an artist if you do your own songs for a while and stuff like that. Do you think finally that long-term impact of the Beatles has dissipated somewhat, in a kind of pop idol, CD sleeve, everything, all those kind of really big things that we credit them with, where are we with that? And
I think their hold has dissipated on what is popular or what is conceived to weirdly to be popular, like the whole X Factor and pop idol thing. That's as manufactured and fake as it's like it's 1960. We're now back to a pre-Beatle time. Something will happen down the line and nobody will have thought of, I hadn't thought about that. And how do we market that? And suddenly there'll be a new thing. But right now we're in some horrible plastic, teeny, croonery, dancey. It is like 1960 again, just the same atmosphere in the air. It's like, oh, please, something happen, please, that isn't fake. And, but I don't think the Beatle power has dissipated with kids who want to be in a group and stand there with guitars and keyboards. I still think that's quite a sizable spur for them. I know kids in their teens, 16, 17 at college that love the Beatles and play Beatles songs, So that is going to carry on, but it's not what's popular right now. What's popular right now is all the fake crap. And so we're going through the let everyone eat candy floss kind of stage, and it's pretty sickening.
I still think it's really bizarre that they had the sales figures out recently. The biggest selling British act from 91 to 2011 was the Beatles by, on a worldwide scale.
Really?
There's only one act actually outsold them. So
there's hope for us all.
They sold 56 million albums in the last 20 years. And that doesn't include the recent lot on iTunes, because they've sold 2 million tracks on iTunes in a month or something. Right, so wait a bit. But the only person who outsold them in that 20 years, Garth Brooks. What the hell?
Seriously?
Yeah, 56 million.
Garth Brooks.
Yeah. It shocked me, that figure as well. I'm not sure which is more shocking, the Garth Brooks one, or the fact that in the last 20 years, Britain hasn't managed to overtake that hold in a way.
That's insane. Oh, Garth Brooks, I think I need to lay down there.
It's a bit shocking. And he's a terrible football commentator as well. No, anyway, but...
So anything else?
So Simon Cowell is not only the devil; he's also Larry Pond. Is that?
No, well, he is. He's not the devil. He's. Simon Cowell. I've got a lot of time for. I've never met the bloke, but I see him on TV on these things, and I think, he's a smart bloke, and he tells it like it is, and he kind of deserves all the success that he's got. But that success comes at the mentally obese making fake aspartame music that he shovels into us. And of course, anyone with any sus doesn't get involved in this. It's just all a joke, and they're miming, that's terrible, But there's an awful lot of young kids out there who need something, and because that's shoveled down their necks, they think that's it. To them, Cheryl Cole is the Beatles, Scary, huh?
The often described, I think someone described it as the greatest fairy story of the 20th century. So in retrospect, as a final question, what's your take on it now? And just to reiterate the first question, would you want to imagine the world without that?
I can't imagine the world without the Beatles for hundreds of reasons. Can you imagine that everybody's hair pre-1963 stuck up? Then after 1963, everybody's hair stuck down. And what a huge cultural shift. They changed the way you have your hair. For the previous 100 years, everyone's hair was up and brushed up and back. And no, overnight, down it came. What? World War I and II couldn't do that. But 4 singing lads could do that. They've changed the way that the male wears his hair from 100 years of that previously. Just that alone. Don't even bother with the other stuff. The fact that they changed the hair habits of 100 years overnight.
Everyone in Japan still has a Beatle haircut as well. That's the strangest thing.
My little theory why the Beatles were so big in Japan is because John Lennon looks Oriental. There you go. I've said it.
The sleeve, the little transition from John to Yoko on Merry Christmas.
Yes.
Over the single.
You get halfway through and it starts getting a bit Julian and what's his name? Who's the other one?
Sean,
yeah. Shaun of the Dead. You get halfway there and look, it's Julian and Sean, But that's my theory why. Did you notice if you ever had Beatle records from different countries, they always picked photos for the front of the EP or the single or whatever, where they caught the Beatles looking like that nationality. You'd have Spanish Beatle EPs, and they'd like turn the dial up so they all look really tanned and their hair would look really dark. Or you'd see a Japanese one where they're all laughing and their eyes look a bit sort of screwed up. I sound a bit Prince Philip now, but I think the Beatles were big in Japan because of the John Lennon looked quasi-Oriental. And all right, take me away now. I've said it.
There's one of those. Oh, right. Okay, great. Thank you.